Let's talk about drivers a little bit. If you think about it, a driver is really just an add-on to the kernel. And if you really think about it, you can probably figure out why. Here is a typical computer, at least I should say typical Windows operating system. It's got some services and process that serve the software up here. This is all user mode. It all operates with permissions for the user. Now there is also a kernel mode, and this stuff here, these are programs that operate in a mode that allows them access to the hardware. The kernel itself has several drivers. The kernel is that central core of the Windows operating system, and it has a lot of built-in drivers that come with it. A lot of those drivers are loaded at the time that the Windows installation is done in order to support whatever hardware it finds. But now let's say we come along and we add a new piece of hardware. Let's say that I bring a printer alongside and I add that printer, say through a USB port or a network connection. Well, the driver for that particular printer will probably not be in that kernel. It may have a driver that'll run basic printing, but it probably won't do the scanning and faxing and all those kinds of things. So I need to add my own driver. Well, if you think of it this way, the drivers that I add here, these are my new drivers, will support the new hardware. So since this is where the drivers exist, most drivers exist here in kernel mode and are extensions of the kernel. Let's go back here to our notes, and you'll see that I said most drivers operate in kernel mode. Now that is not true 100% of the time. There are drivers that work in user mode. However, for our purposes, we're going to assume they all operate in kernel mode. Now every hardware device requires a driver, but since many of them are built into the Windows kernel, we don't have to worry about most of the ones that are built onto the motherboard itself. If you have a 32-bit or a 64-bit operating system, it will require different drivers. Basically, the driver has to support the type of Windows system that it's installed on. Therefore, if you go to the printer manufacturer, HP or some other, you'll probably find a 64-bit version of the driver and a 32-bit version of the driver. Major releases, in other words, new kernels, also require new drivers. So if I update from Windows 7, which was, I think, NT 6.2 or 6.3, something like that, and go to NT 10, I will probably require different drivers for that version. Now let's take a look at where these drivers exist in the file structure. If they have not yet been installed, now don't be put off by this word uninstalled. That doesn't mean it's been installed and now is not installed. It means it has not yet been installed. So drivers that are ready to go, in other words, several are built into Windows already, but they are not activated because that particular piece of hardware is not installed on the system. So all of these uninstalled drivers exist in C Windows System 32 Driver Store. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to go to C Windows System 32 and then down to Driver Store. I went too far. Let's go back. Driver Store. And here in this file repository, you'll see that I have lots and lots of drivers that are ready to go, ready to be used. If I click on one, you'll see I have a couple of different files in here, an INF file and an SYS file. Now the INF file is the setup information file. In other words, it's just information about how to set up this driver. In fact, if I right click on that and I'm going to say open with Notepad, you can see that I have lots of information in here about this driver, the driver versions, providers, classes, all that kind of stuff. Here is the name of the actual driver file, and you can see it matches with this one over here. It's got information about the registry. Somewhere in here should be information about the registry entries that need to be made when this is installed. I don't see it off the top of my head, so I'm not going to make you... Oh wait, there was an ad, Greg. I just saw it down here. Some information about that. So there's all sorts of information about how this driver should be installed. The SYS is the driver itself. So let's talk about those a little bit. The INF file is the installer, and it is kept in C Windows INF. So let's go back here. I'm just going to go back to C Windows, and then let's take a look at the INF folder. And as if I scroll down, you'll see a whole lot of INF. There's also something called PNF. I'm not going to get into that. You can look it up if you want to. But INF files, this is where the installed drivers INFs exist. Now once we install the driver, we also need to have that sys file. Sometimes it's a DLL file, and really the sys file is just a modified form of a DLL file, dynamic link library. It has the code in it about how to run that thing, and these are going to be found in C Windows System 32 drivers. So Windows System 32 drivers. Now these are all the installed ones, so you can see all the various installed drivers that we have on this system right now. Drivers can come from the product's website, the manufacturer's website. They can be packaged with a disk or a link somewhere that come with a product, and some can also be installed through Windows Update. So Windows does recognize some device types and allows drivers to be installed through the updater, or at least updated through the updater. And in the next video, we're going to talk about additional software that can come with some drivers, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can deal with those.